sure everyone can hear me. So, for those who didn't hear me, my name is Kate Merton. I am the head of JLabs on the East Coast, JLabs being the innovation incubator arm of Johnson & Johnson. And I have been given the pleasure of leading today's panel discussion on Here's My Genome, Call Me Maybe. And this was named very specifically because it kind of speaks to pop culture and what's going on with the masses, and now more so than ever, genomic data is available to the masses, and we wanted to have a very rich discussion on how biology, genomic data is coming together with technology and what impact that is having. So I am joined today by an esteemed panel who I have, prior to this, already stalked on LinkedIn, and I know their background, but instead of me butchering it, I was actually going to hand it over to them for a couple of minutes so they could each give their background. So if we'd like to start off with David, and we'll work our way across.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. My name is David Webster. I work for a company called IDEO, design consulting company. I'm a partner there. I've been with the company for 20 years. My background is mechanical engineering, industrial design, but I am a design generalist. My role at IDEO is I lead our product and technology portfolio, which means I look for new affordances of new technologies, and I take leaps of faith with teams to figure out how to make them matter to people on their terms and how to generate value from that. So, you know, the headline for what I do is humanizing technology at IDEO.
That's good. I'm going to come to the question about what's your favorite song in a minute.
Oh,
so.
yeah. That's a really tough... And by the way, it didn't help you forewarning us about that question. It's just been torture trying to think about what's the right song.
Next time, I'll be surprised, David. I wanted to be nice.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah.
So if we just go on to Ayana.
Yes, hi, I'm Yana Dimkova from GE Ventures. I'm a director of healthcare investing, and at GE Ventures, which is the venture capital arm of General Electric. We focus on supporting innovative companies across healthcare, energy, IoT, advanced manufacturing, and we're really looking to be a force of innovation within General Electric as we sort of focus on the next steps across all of those industry verticals.
And then Linda.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Linda Avey, and I guess you could say I'm an entrepreneur. And this all sort of came out of what I thought was necessity. In college, I majored in biology, but my favorite class was genetics. I just loved the concept of the genome. And then I went to work in the field of genetic testing, but I saw a pattern of really lack of statistical power. We were doing studies all over the US, but none of them really had the power to find the things we were looking for. And so I had this idea for empowering individuals and consumers to get their own genetic data. It really hit me when I was at a trade show, and I was walking through looking at all these little booths of all this and that, and there was one company there that actually had a saliva tube where you could spit and get DNA out of it, and I thought, this is crazy, you can't do this. And I took it back to the lab at the company I was working for at the time and just said, this is pretty amazing. And they said, well, Linda, why don't you be the guinea pig and you can spit into this and we'll see if it works. And it worked beautifully, and that's where the light bulb went on. And all of this sort of led to starting 23andMe. And I'm on to my next venture, which is called Precisely, which is kind of a continuation of that effort of empowering individuals to get their own data so that we can move this concept of precision medicine forward more quickly.
Yeah, and Linda and I were having a great discussion before about sort of really putting that data in the power of the patient. But before we get there, you did just hear me allude to the fact that I had asked everyone to think about what their favorite song was before we actually get into the detailed discussion, just to kind of normalize and learn a little bit more about you, not what you've been doing, but you as a person. So what's your favorite song, David?
After much deliberation, I consulted my iPhone, and the one that bubbled up to the top was the song. There was this band back in the 90s in the UK called The Prodigy, and there's this song called Voodoo People, which is very, it's very meaningful to the aging raver. It was like my turbo song, and I find myself requiring my turbo song more and more these days, so that's it.
Thank you for the honesty. And
So in the spirit of honesty, if I had to be honest, it would probably be a Disney song, but I am too embarrassed to admit that, so I will not be that upfront about it. I will go with one of the few songs from the Beatles that nobody knows, I've Just Seen a Face.
Oh, interesting. Linda. Well, I was also going to go to my iTunes playlist and just see which song I've listened to the most, but didn't have time for that. But I'd say Marvin Gaye, What's Going On?
Wonderful, wonderful selections, and not to kind of keep myself out of it, I was trying to think about it, and I go between classical and non. So classical, probably Pachelbel's Canon, and then when I need to get motivated to go running, it's probably something out of Pitbull, which maybe I should not admit to you, but that's actually the truth. So anyway, back to Here's My Genome, Call Me Maybe, and I wanted to pose the first question to you, Linda, about knowing what you know now and everything that you did with 23andMe and sort of the expectations for people's personal use of their genetic data. What's your thoughts on where we've come to now? Did it actually end up where you thought it would when you first started out with 23andMe?
Well, I think the big driver of Ancestry being what really got people so excited, and Spencer Wells is here in the room, and he was one of the first people that really tapped into this interest that people have in their ancestry and where they've come from. That continues today, and I think that's really driving so much of the industry, actually. Things I would do differently, looking back now at what we were trying to do at 23andMe. Just a show of hands, I'm curious, how many people have either done Ancestry.com or 23andMe or, wow, that's pretty awesome. Early on when we did the health reports before the FDA came in and said, let's stop this for now, I think what we were trying to do was just too far of a reach, trying to tell people what their risk for certain diseases were, because it was too preliminary and we really didn't have enough data at that point. So I think we had these really great ambitions of educating people about genetics, but I just don't think we had enough information to really draw the conclusions we did. So I would probably pull back quite a bit on those reports that we did back then.
Done a little bit differently. So,
yeah.
David, you and I were talking about before this, do you have any aspects thinking about from a personal sort of design perspective? If you were way back then with 23andMe and you'd seen it rolled out the way it is, do you have any insights of how you would have expected things to go differently?
Yeah, I mean, just for context, we have had, per my introduction, we've got a lot of appetite amongst our designers to jump in and explore the potential of genome science, and we're by no means expert, of course, but we've had a few adventures with various companies in the space, most recently a company called Dog.ai, and we were very much involved in Helix's launch. And so in the course of those projects, we've done a lot of user research into how people characterize the affordances of genome science and how they make sense of it. And I thought I had decent intuition, like referring to how I characterized it, that would inform where we got to with that research. But I realized that I was much less trusting and much less exuberant about the potential of it, actually. I engaged with 23andMe early, and I thought, okay, I'm going to suspend my discomfort at not really understanding what happens, and not really knowing where the information resides and all that kind of thing, and I'm going to engage for some quite hard medical reasons, just to see if I find out anything that's of relevance medically, and then I did that, and that was the sort of value for me. But what we found when we're testing the notion of finding out about your genome with users is people are initially generally were not interested in engaging. If you got them over that little hump and got them to try it and think about it and just generate any mental model, then they were super interested. Then they were kind of all in, and at least as fascinated by the non-medical interesting applications as by the medical applications. And that was quite surprising to me.
So would you say, sort of tagging on to that, would you say that you kind of had to show them the value of it, or you just kind of had to be able to extrapolate the data?
Actually, I would say actually not show the value of it. It's because it gets quite. It's early. It's still early enough days that, and because it's for all the very good reasons that it's regulated, there's not a lot of claimable cause and effect value yet. Because you have to engage the masses to generate the giant data sets that allow you to recognize correlations. But that wasn't actually as important to people as just kind of breaking the seal and getting over the initial inhibition about engaging with the space. And then it was like, the fact that it was interesting was valuable enough.
So it's that initial engagement. So
Yeah.
you kind of commented that maybe we haven't got there yet, and I think, Linda, you touched upon that. So Jana, if I could come to you and say, being in GE Ventures and you spend a lot of time looking at what's coming next, what most excites you about this area and the use of personal genomic data?
So I think that we are big believers that the pace of technological innovation has never been faster. There are these incredible therapeutics. You have companies going public with, in many cases, not having a lot of clinical trial data. You have fantastic diagnostics that are coming to market that are starting to be more adopted across sort of clinician groups. But then there's sort of this middle ground of, well, how do you marry the two? And I think we really try to be very thoughtful about solutions that really help bring the science to the patient in a meaningful way that hopes to improve quality of outcomes in a responsible and cost-efficient manner. And if you look at our portfolio, we've invested in a company called SciOps that's about actually making molecular data accessible to the physician. As you can imagine, there's so many different data points. Physicians are overwhelmed with having to actually sift through their patient's diagnosis and all of the health records related to it. So it can be difficult for them to actually incorporate the newest test into their clinical treatment protocols. And so SciOps allows them to do that. So they can actually take advantage of these new tests and at the same time match them to the right therapeutic. In addition to that, we've noticed over time that, especially in the diagnostic space, you had these new panels that really help promise in trying to figure out exactly what genes needed to be targeted and better analyzed. But they produce these reports, especially in oncology patients, that could be 100 or 200 pages long. And so some physicians that we spoke to said, look, I'd love to give this to my patient. I would love to be able to prescribe the right therapeutic, but I simply don't really understand what these contents are telling me. So we invested in a company that really tries to help physicians better interpret tests, not just physicians, but also payers, through a telemedicine platform that allows physicians and payers to have access to genetic counselors. And genetic counselors are really the ones who are holding the key to kind of bridging the gap between the physician and the therapeutic. So I think that's what we are really excited about, because we know the potential is there, we know the data is there, but how do you actually bring it into a space where it touches the patient in a very real and meaningful way?
How it actually touches the patient. Yeah, I always think that's so important. Linda, I do actually want to ask you what you're the most excited about and maybe what you're anticipating in 2025. But just before we get there, David, going back to you and you're thinking about the user interface and how you make it applicable for them. Anything sort of in the research that you've done at IDEO that you wanted to build upon what Jana was just saying?
I mean, the one thing that I would say, I don't know if it's more of a question stemming from an observation than an answer, which is to recognize the obvious growing clinical value that good data can be the source of, and recognizing that that's articulating that value and like capturing the data to enable that value is harder because we're all kind of messy, emotional, irrational people, and there's a lot of engagement that can happen in a less earnest, less clean way. Mm-hmm. And the optimist in me says that just achieving that engagement, at least you've got people at the party, and then you can go on a journey towards generating the level of integrity of data that is useful in a clinical sense. And I would say that's something that has definitely been borne out by our research.
Got it. That's really interesting, sort of just making them interested in bringing them in. So if we go back to, when we think about 2025, from your perspective, Linda, the experience you've had and where you're going with precisely, what is the thing that you're most excited about?
Well, it's having been in the field long enough to know that things don't happen very quickly. Mm-hmm. You know, it's hard to think that's not that long from now, really, in the grand scheme of things. But what I would love to see, and what we're hoping to facilitate, is giving people access to the data that's most important for their health and empowering them to be aware of what's going on in their environment, what the right foods are they should be eating, how much sleep is really optimal for them at night. All of this stuff that goes into our health that just really isn't part of our medical care right now. But to see all of that data be accessible and then usable, to have the utility to start to figure out, okay, what supplements should I probably be on? Do I have broken pathways for certain genes that metabolize folate, for example? There's just a number of things that are going on in our bodies that once we have access to that information, we call it the Precision Medicine Initiative, but I think we should really call it Precision Health, that we can hopefully figure out from our own data how we're going to stay healthier. And that's going to be someday in the future. I don't know if we'll be there by 2025. Mm-hmm. But the other piece of it then is, I think, individuals being able to own and control their data. This should not be something we just blithely hand over to other big companies or whomever, and then they take it and run with it and get all the value out of it. We should also, I think, benefit from our own data. And as we talked about earlier, I think blockchain could be a very interesting way to facilitate that. So I can't wait to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, Linda knows I'm very passionate about patients owning their own data. Do you see anything maybe from a regulatory perspective that will get in the way of that occurring from your experience?
Well, I would hope that the regulators agree with that perspective. And the onus on companies like ours is to make the data as understandable and be as responsible as we can for helping hold on to it, and then giving individuals the ability to decide, well, I want to send it off either to my doctor, or I like this researcher at UCSF. I'm going to disseminate my data how I choose. And I think it's more about control. And I think the regulators hopefully will see the value of that, because when you talk to people, for instance, at the FDA, they get very excited about this kind of data access as well. And I think when they understand that individuals will be the ones deciding, that it really is a game changer, and it's just not all going to be centralized in one place. And that's, again, where the blockchain, I think, could distribute it in very interesting ways, and but still retain the anonymity, but all of these smart contracts that could be going on around data like that. Mm-hmm. That's probably the thing I'm most excited about right now.
Very much agree with you on that one. So, Jana, you mentioned some of the things that GE Ventures are invested in right now. If you were to look even further out, is there something from a personal perspective, maybe not necessarily blockchain, but something from a personal perspective you're like, I really think that's going to be key for healthcare in the future using precision medicine?
So I think we're spending a lot of time looking at solutions that help to make clinical trials more efficient, help to increase recruitment, enrollment, and retention of patients, and then hopefully help with follow-up. And one of the reasons why we're doing that is because we really believe that if you have great diagnostics, that you could then do a better job of actually convincing physicians to either refer patients to clinical trials, or in some cases actually going directly to the patient and telling them for whatever condition they have, there might be a clinical trial out there that's available to them. I think the reason that we hold this excitement is, one, if you look at the way the clinical trial is are currently done. You have pharma companies spending thousands of dollars to actually recruit a patient. Enrollment rates are hovering around 3 or 4%. Trials take a very long time to actually enroll. So if you think about that, that's just years where you're slowing drugs that could be incredibly helpful in multiple conditions from reaching the patient. And we think that it is clinical trials that really drive the adoption of guidelines and again marry the therapeutic to the guideline. And we feel that that's where genetics can play a huge role, and we'll continue to be very excited about it.
So you think that, just to make sure I was tracking properly, so you think that people having their own genetic data, they would be able to self-identify themselves for a clinical trial? And you think there'd be more active participation, or you think from the other side where physicians would know about their clinical data or genomic data and would ask them to come in?
I think we're probably more focused on the clinician side at the moment, but we actually have a company in our portfolio called Evidation Health that has about 2 million patients that they have access to, that they reach out to when there's a particular trial that needs to be undertaken. And so they can actually enroll trials very quickly in areas like diabetes or sleep apnea. And so then you're actually making that connection directly through the patient. You're able to recruit trials in days versus it taking you 18 months. So we definitely see promise in that as well. So we're trying to parallel paths, but I'm still excited about it.
You're engaging the consumer or the patient here seems to be so important. Is there, if you were thinking about the patient and some watch outs, we have heard that there's some concerns about, there's obviously a lot of people here that weren't concerned about getting their genomic data, but those that are, they're then concerned about what comes next. Is someone going to be using this against me? Is the insurance company going to know things about me that are potentially going to be an issue and cause my premiums to increase? Do any of you have kind of thoughts or comments on that?
Well, it certainly was a question we got right away at 23andMe. There was a lot of concern. And so one good bit of news, though, was that GINA passed, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which passed with flying colors through both the House and the Senate. And I think it was Clinton who signed it, or Bush, I don't remember, it's been so long. But that at least was protection against discrimination by an employer or health insurance providers. So that was at least one way that we were able to show that, you know, we can put protections in place, but that didn't really address long-term care insurance, life insurance issues. But after 12 years, I don't know that there's any example of anyone being discriminated against based on their genetic data. So far so good, but I think we just all have to be very vigilant about it. And when stories do come out, I think there were some stories that happened well before 23andMe, but where companies were trying to discriminate against potential employees having problems, and they could weed them out. Like, I forget, there's many stories about this, but it seems that when it gets out in the press and out in the media, that the companies pull back and they realize that that's just not fair game. And I think we'll continue to follow this and watch it very carefully, and hopefully we'll get to a point where people feel comfortable enough that that's not going to be an issue.
So that will be off the table. Any other thoughts on that before I start asking about other technologies?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the concern is very, very real. You know, I think it doesn't just pertain to your genome. It's people are getting quite anxious and feeling quite vulnerable about their data in general. You know, so you know, being in this sector, being cognizant of the fact that that's a hot button for people is a wise thing to be. The optimist in me says that we'll go through this kind of extremely frothy, turbulent, sensational kind of cryptocurrency adventure period, and then people will start to see different kinds of manifestations of the blockchain, and that will become this really powerful thing to get us out of this period of kind of feeling a little bit exploited,
Yeah.
and feeling a lot more agency and control. And if we can get from here to there without things blowing up, then I think that'll be a great time to build trust.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's all about the value of the data, right? It's, when you're first getting your genetic information, like you might have experienced, where it's like, well, I don't even really know what I'm getting here, and what is the value of it? But once you start to see what comes from accessing your data, and then now you benefit from that, it's a game changer. And I think people have different perspectives once they learn how this is going to hopefully improve their health because they have knowledge, things they should be on the lookout for, things they can do with their lifestyle and all of that. So it's all about the value. And as hopefully all of us working together are going to be able to establish more and more of that value, and then we'll see that, I think, in the consumer side. Because, this has been going on now for whatever, a decade, more than a decade, where people are starting to access the data. And it's a slow-moving boat, unfortunately. It takes a long time to really make these discoveries and make the connections between how you feel and how your genetics might have influenced that. Mm-hmm. But we're making progress, and it's starting to move along, and we've just scratched the surface. I think the prediction is by the end of this year, there will be 15 million people who've either done 23andMe or Ancestry, just those two companies. So it's just lifting off. Back in the day when we started the company, we were like, oh my God, to have 1 million people, that would just be insane. And now it's at 5 million. So it's getting there, but it's a slow slog.
Slow slog, but definitely worth it. I know, sort of from my own personal perspective, it's so exciting. So people are mildly interested. Maybe there's a lot of concern, but when they do get to that stage where they actually feel empowered by the data and they can make their own better personal decisions for them and their family, that's where, I can't wait to see it get to. Now, maybe to get there, you might have to have other industries lean in. So thinking about moving away from the direct biology and other technologies, are there other aligned industries you're thinking might start coming in and using the personal data? I'm not sure if you've seen anything in your work with GE Ventures. So we've kind of touched on blockchain technology, but other things.
So there's definitely, I think, a lot of overlap in terms of what's sort of driving the evolution in the genomics field. I think yesterday I met with a company that's using 3D printing to come up with a better diagnostic in terms of the actual plastic that you use when you go ahead and create samples for commonly tested diseases, anything from flu to others. And so you see those types of technologies, and interestingly enough, that you can see a connection between that and obviously healthcare and some of the things that we're more deeply interested in as well.
That definitely was not one I was expecting. 3D printing and genomics.
Yes, I think the FDA is staying pretty clear of using 3D printing for anything that's at the moment really related to actual cells. But if you look at it in terms of using it for implants or other devices, it's definitely on something that they are excited about, and maybe will move more quickly on some of the other initiatives that are becoming.
So I know before, when we were talking in the green room, Linda, you kind of mentioned about pharmacogenomics and how the potential partnering could go on with the healthcare, such as Johnson & Johnson, companies who actually design drugs. What would, from your perspective, be an ideal partnership? So not just kind of empowering the patient with they know what the information is, but how can you work with the other parts of the healthcare industry in their research and development to make it even more impactful?
Well, we all have this vision that at some point, whether it's 2025 or later, that nobody takes a drug that is not going to work for them. And how do we get to that magical place where that is actually happening? And so I think this is another case in point for giving people access to that information. So it's pretty well characterized, all the different genes that are involved when we take a drug. When I worked at Affymetrix, we had a panel called ADME, which is just about, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, what your body does when you take any kind of a drug. And so because we know these mechanisms, the liver enzymes, all these things that go into action when you take a foreign chemical, and it can be cannabis, it can be anything, right? So once you understand how your body responds to a drug, that information is hugely valuable to a pharma that's trying to develop a drug for your condition you might have. And so that's, to me, is one of the most clear-cut examples of a pretty well-characterized data set that once you have access to that, you could put that on the blockchain and say, hey, J&J, I'm a patient with rheumatoid arthritis, and here's my pharmacogenetic information. I mean, how powerful would that be, right, for recruiting for trials? And so that's kind of this world that I think we need to get to, where patients have that data, they are empowered to put it out and make it accessible to the companies that could make a drug very, very targeted to them. We're seeing it in cancer, luckily, just these very fine-tuned treatments for a tumor type, but that's much harder when you've got a person who's got something like chronic fatigue syndrome. There's no tumor to go in and interrogate, right, and study and look at and measure. It's much more complicated in most chronic conditions, but that's why we're focusing there rather than in the oncology area.
And that truly is fascinating. And one, you mentioned, David, earlier that you wish I hadn't asked you about the song because then it caused you to worry. So I'm going to ask you a question which I did not prep you for.
Awesome.
So I'm curious to know about regional variations. We know that obviously the regulations across the different countries in which we function in healthcare are so very different.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the genomic data, your work with IDEO, have you seen a big difference across the different regions? And I'd love to get the other two inputs as well.
You mean when it comes to the data or people's attitudes towards the data?
People's attitude, say in the US, to using it versus people who are used to socialized medicine in Europe versus what's going on in China. And I didn't prep you for this.
Yeah,
so
I mean, honestly, like when I think about all of our adventures in it, they've been very US centric so far because they've been with. I guess that's where a lot of the charges being led when it comes to innovation. Maybe that's not true, but that's that in our experience, the companies that we've worked with to explore the potential of the space of being US based, and so I can't really. It would be pure conjecture to think about like what the differences are between the regions. I mean,
we don't need to go into conjecture. That's okay. So, from a GE perspective, looking at the other regions, have you got some sort of insights about how it's landing differently in the different areas?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because sometimes when you live in the U.S., you obviously have a very centric view, and it's widely known that some of the best scientists in the world reside here. Obviously, the U.S. government invests a ton of money. I'm sure everyone wishes they invested more in kind of making science more progressive. But I spent time in other countries, and I think you and I talked about this briefly earlier today. For example, in Finland, because there's such concern over the homogeneity of the population, they actually started taking a piece of either the belly button or the umbilical cord when the child was first born, and they've been doing that for 15 or 20 years. So that it's going to be one of the most complete data sets in terms of the actual population that exists anywhere. In Iceland, similar story in terms of having to think through, how do we make sure that it's such a small population that we don't have specific diseases that are passed on from parent to child that we are aware of. So I think that obviously much more difficult to do in the U.S., right, to adopt that kind of approach. I think Finland has 4 EHRs. I think we have about 4 million, or at least that's what it feels like on a day-to-day basis. But you've seen this kind of approach taken by smaller countries to really better understand their populations, especially when there's significant risks involved. And I think there's a lot to learn from them and some of the lessons they've extracted over time.
That's a really good example. So, Linda, if you're sort of what you're doing precisely, do you see other startups in other regions doing similar things or going about it a different way?
Well, the question always comes up on the regulatory side, right? And there's been a lot of conversation around how much easier it would be to launch companies in China. And if you can forge partnerships over there, you're not going to have some of the same regulatory oversight. But that's something that it comes with a whole bunch of other challenges. So yeah. I would be hesitant, I think, to go that route. But I think we're in a really good position here in the U.S. Trying to be optimistic about Yeah, we have a very diverse population, which is wonderful, at least for now, it's diverse. And I think we can learn so much in this country that can apply to other countries, because we represent everybody here. And so the exciting thing for me would be to have precisely be accessing a lot of these different populations and learning from the subtypes, and then being able to spread that word off to India, off to China, and some of these other countries that we hopefully could benefit, because they do tend to have more, they're more similar, not quite as diverse as we are here.
All right, so you definitely don't see a limitation doing not going to other countries because we have perhaps stricter regulatory processes. You think just as much can get done here as there?
Yeah, I think you just have to be mindful, and you have to communicate with the FDA. I mean, they're people. They welcome other humans coming in and talking to them. It's not a bad thing. I mean, I think they're really reasonable, great people, and you just have to continually communicate with them. That's the key.
That's an awesome quote, and I hope someone is tweeting that out right now. That the FDA are human, and you need to communicate with them. So I know that there's going to be a lot of questions from the audience because we have such an esteemed panel. But before I get there, I did kind of wanted to offer it back to you. Out of this discussion, is there any other kind of like burning platform you wanted to speak to, or any final comments you wanted to offer the audience before it's open season, and they can start asking you more questions that you're not thinking?
I mean, so let me think about how to say this. Sorry, I started talking before I knew what I was going to say. But there's something. So we've touched it enough as designers for me to think that I am not wrong in being very, very, very optimistic about where it can lead to. Mm-hmm. And that's really incredibly exciting. But between here and activating that reality, there's this daunting task of getting people comfortable with like 3 or 4 different things which you can't expect them to have much knowledge about at all, and which seem complicated. Right. And there's this sort of multiplier effect. We're working with this company called .ai, who I'm like very excited about, and they're trying to decentralize information using the blockchain. They're trying to capture data that allows you to pattern recognize across the genome and 9 other omes. Mm-hmm. And I believe there's massive, massive, massive potential there, like to improve people's lives in all sorts of ways. But just helping people who are leading busy lives and getting on with being normal to get their head around all of, not just 1 ohm, but 10 ohms multiplied by the blockchain, where all they really know in the 5 minutes they spend every day thinking about the blockchain is bros and Lambos, and it's like, so there's a really amazing design challenge around formatting all of this for engageability. And I love that design challenge.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about. So putting that in a sort of, I'm not sure if palatable is the right word, but maybe in an engaging format.
Yeah.
So everyone can get on board with it.
Yeah.
Point? Yeah.
So I think that one of the things I am really, really excited about is that there's been this revolution that everybody's been waiting for what feels like a very long time. And to me, that revolution doesn't really come to reality until you see community hospitals, which still treat the majority of patients in the US, begin to adopt some of the lessons that we're learning from this genetic information. And the incredible thing is it is finally happening. And we have a couple of hospital partners that we've been working with very closely over the last couple of months, who are taking amazing strides, is suddenly thinking through how to manage their population and again, in a very responsible way, taking into account all of the information they're gathering by actually making genetic testing more widely available, better understanding the social determinants of health, which again are so important to this, and you can actually say that that is an integral part of precision medicine. So I think when you start seeing it happening in that setting, that's when you actually feel like things are coming to fruition. Because I do feel like I spend most of my day in the clouds, and it's a great place to be. It's really amazing. Incredible things happen there. But then when you actually enter the doors of a community hospital and see all the possibilities that you can have for improvement and know what's out there from a technology perspective, and suddenly you start seeing the marriage of the two, it becomes a really good place to be.
I think I want to come join you in this class.
Anytime.
Good to know. So Linda, any thoughts from you before we open it up to you?
Well, I think the only thing is just to plant the idea that it's your data and you should demand control of it. I just think the days of people just giving data over without getting something in return should be over. And it's kind of I think back in, even 10 years ago, it would have been crazy for people to think that, but now I think we're in a new era. I think Facebook has really trained us all that, we're the product. And yeah, we get a lot of benefit out of Facebook. For some people anyway. But I think the same thing will be true of our health data, that once we own it and control it, then there's so much power to that, and we should be in charge of that. So maybe it's not, here's my genome, maybe it's called, don't call me, I'll call you.
Please, someone tweet that one out. That is perfect, yeah, and I think, I've often hear it said that data is the new currency, and I think that is incredibly true, and the sooner we put it in the hands of the patients and kind of empower them to make their own decisions, the better we are going to be as a society. So, any questions? I think, do we want people to go to the microphone?
Yeah, I can talk loud too if that's easier. Okay, perfect. Hi, Patrick Offner. I work in our PwC's Health Incubator. And so my question for you is, I think everybody's touched on it a little bit, and certainly access to the data is paramount importance, as is the control. And so much of the value in healthcare is in the data, but the value isn't the data. So how are you taking this approach to actually informing, educating, continuing to engage, and ultimately improving health? So I may have more insights about my current state and my past. What are you doing to help influence the future of my health and make me care about a time horizon that really is so far off?
Yeah, well, that is a huge user interface challenge, right? And one of the things we struggle with is we are still in a research stage. We don't really have a lot of products around the genome, despite some of the apps that Helix is supporting now about finding out what kind of wine you might like and some of these things that could be interesting, but it's going to be this iterative process. And so the challenge on software companies like ours is, how do we make it engaging enough for you to stay involved and wanting to contribute additional data? Because genetic data on its own is pretty meaningless, right? We need to have all the phenotypic data to go with that. What diagnoses do you have? How did you respond to a drug? Do you have allergies? All these bits of information that if we can assemble that all together in one place, that's where it starts to become meaningful and then could become predictive. So it's a perfect question for this space, because we have to try to figure out what are those kind of delighters, if you will, that's in the design world, of what makes people keep coming back, what engages them, and what creates that stickiness around this process, because it is a process that's going to take time.
David, thoughts and delighters?
Well, there's the best example, or I can think of, about that might start to answer the question is a company started by an ex-colleague, ex-ideal colleague of mine called Neil Grimmer, called Habit, and it's a food and nutrition primarily company, but it also has a exercise and lifestyle aspect to it. And they use genomic data and a couple of biological responses to different meals that you take, and you do a little blood swab to profile you and then they make that kind of interesting and engageable by using that as a basis for an ongoing conversation with you about your nutrition and your exercise regimen. And what's interesting about that is it's about pursuit of a positive rather than mitigation of a negative, which is interesting because a lot of the clinical application of the genome is about mitigation of a negative. It's being more informed about this terrible possibility that you have to think about in the future, and that's not motivating for people. This is about pursuit of a positive. And B, it's more dynamic. There's enough kind of variability and that you can generate new news from engaging it over time, and that keeps people engaged and interested. And I think that's a glimpse of maybe some of the heuristics that can make for the kind of experiences that will engage people.
I know there's just someone standing, and then we'll come right to the front. So.
Hi, my name is Brian, and I started an organization called Citizen Science for Health, which is a small nonprofit that's grown out of my own personal experiences of being in part of a couple observational clinical trials, and they were tremendously helpful for my own personal health. Linda, you talked about the slow pace of change. David, you made reference to kind of some of the daunting challenges ahead of us. From the patient empowerment perspective, we all want things to go faster, and I guess the question is, what are the specific things that we in this audience can do? Should we be all going out? Is this the time to get our full genome sequenced? Are there blockchain or patient empowerment groups that we should be supporting? What can we do to accelerate this process?
So I think that exciting technological innovation is fantastic, and talking about some of these new solutions that could help us predict the onset of disease or help us perhaps make sure that we're in the best health we can be are really great endpoints. But I think if we were to look at just how disengaged a lot of us are with our existing state of health in terms of how much do we actually understand how we're physically doing today, right? Just the number of questions that we ask our physicians, the amount of times that we demand information. I think sometimes you actually see that we're much less engaged than we think that we are. And so it's one of those things like you go on your annual checkup and it's a thing you have to do, or the thing your spouse makes you do or your work makes you do, and you spend 30 or 45 minutes going through the test, and then you sort of get this clean bill of health, or somebody says, oh, you're okay. How many of you actually looked at your test and saw that you might have been high on one end or low on the other? And so I actually have seen folks not really demand to understand the information that they already have at their fingerprints. And so that's why I think sometimes when you see, all of these talks about, it's really important that we own our own data. But again, are we really focusing on what's actually actionable and what's really there? So I wish that there was more focus on that versus kind of looking to the future, which is a great place to be. But I think you'd be surprised as to how many medication errors, how many diagnostic errors can be prevented if the patient just went home, took the test that they had just had administered, put their symptoms into Google and said, let me make sure I understand this so I can ask more informed questions, because I know that I see 4 physicians and 7 nurses that have 3 EHRs. There's no possible way they can all be connected and delivering the right diagnosis at the right time every single occasion I'm in that particular setting.
Hi, Brett Market out of One-Sided Technologies. My question was about the thoroughness of testing. So I know like at 23andMe when you started, I think you were using probably like a 700,000 SNP chip. You were testing roughly 700,000 spots out of 38 billion odd on our DNA. How much are we coming to actually testing the whole genome, the whole thing, especially your example of the commercial community hospitals? Are they actually doing full genomic tests and using that, or are they still just sampling?
So I'll answer the quick question, and I think probably better prepared to answer the longer one. So some of the hospitals I referenced are kind of using and again, mostly think of the 200 gene panels. That's what they're focused on. Partially because that's what's accessible at a reasonable price point that in some cases is reimbursed. And then obviously there you have some of those panels that are actually looking at BRCA1 and BRCA2, and the cost point of those has actually gone down as well. They're very accessible. But I think that I don't see us going to whole genome sequencing before really understanding or having more of an idea of what an actionable mutation or what an actual result actually looks like and what care it drives. Because just from the data I've seen, we're just not there yet. But obviously I think you're probably the expert.
I totally agree with you on that. And the good thing is, well, the way to look at it is what question are you trying to answer? And then apply the right technology to the question. So, for instance, with newborn screening, we've got really great technology for that. And for people with rare diseases, there might be applications for full genome sequencing, and we can absolutely do that. But it's not really at a cost point right now that it's applicable to a broad consumer offering. But we're kind of seeing now this tiered sort of testing. Like you can kind of for instance, 23andMe just got approval to do reporting on BRCA, but they only report on 3 markers in those 2 genes, and that's not the full solution, right? But it's a first pass. And then if you are of Jewish ancestry, especially, or from that part of the world where this is a more common form of breast cancer, and your mother might have had it and your aunt might have had it, and you do 23andMe and you don't have those 3 markers, then it's important for that person to understand, well, we only looked at 3. There could be other mutations in those 2 genes that are common to our family that we should be going in and getting full sequencing of those 2 genes. So you just would go in and do that full sequence. So it just depends on the situation, but I totally agree that we're just not there yet where we're just doing broad-based, everybody go out and get your genome sequenced. The value of that right now is questionable.
I did see one other hand.
Hi, I'm Brian, San Francisco. I want to kind of address what David says there, that we should be, or these companies should be addressing instead of just giving them generic data, they should actually give them something actionable. I wonder if you could speak to the point that there are many companies that are giving action or data that goes beyond what the science would say. So for instance, we looked into making a company in the gut microbiome, and there are companies that are doing probiotics for the gut microbiome, and there are many willing payers for that, but there's not a whole lot of data to support that it actually works. So I'm curious how you balance the idea that people want this, and that there are companies willing to give them that, but then the data doesn't support it.
I think you've got to, in my experience, once you get people over that initial hump of being skeptical and out of their element, and not necessarily trusting, then the good news is that they're more than capable of understanding where the limits of the robust knowledge are. So you can. There's plenty of examples of this with a lot of the companies that are sitting on top of Helix. You can, with clear language, caveat the cause and effect information that the genome provides is not robust and not there yet, but there are all of these other factors that influence, how you're going to do by engaging with this protocol or this lifestyle or this regimen, and people understand that. It doesn't negate the value in their minds of having engaged with the genome science aspect of it. If you go to Habit, which I mentioned earlier, they very carefully say, hey, the jury's still out as to whether what we've learned about your genome is actually material to how you're engaging with our resources for nutrition and lifestyle will play out. And people are okay with the jury being out, and they're more than capable of understanding that. And so I think, I don't know if that answers your question. I lost track.
I would just say I'm a huge skeptic on most of this stuff. I hate to say it, but it's so complex how much our genome influences things like these really complicated, like what diet you should be on, what exercise you should be doing. I think you mostly just have to go through your own experience and figure out what works for you, and maybe someday genetics will shed some light on that, but I think for the most part, it's just such a tangled web of biology and so many other factors that just simply looking at genetics, I just remain very skeptical about that approach for now. But someday maybe we'll get there, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying, David, that there's an amazing opportunity, but I think not going to that dangerous thing of extrapolating too much of what the data is telling you is key. And I think to your point, if you're very honest with people about it's an amazing opportunity, but let's not go too far with it, that might be the way to engage people and not have false hopes. I think we've got time for one more question. There's someone right towards the lady here.
Hi, I have a quick question. So, what are your thoughts, and I was a little bit late, so you may have already addressed this, but what are your thoughts about, and just to make this concrete, if someone were to discover that they were like APOE4 positive through 23andMe, and
which I did. It's been out in the open. I'm public about it, yeah.
I've considered not having children because of that.
Oh, God, no.
And I don't know anyone else. It's one of those things where I feel like I'm coming out to some degree, and not to diminish the actual real issue of coming out about other things, but do you think that this will become a new kind of identity form where people will have their gender, they'll have their nationality, their ethnicity, and then certain genomic or genetic kind of traits that kind of are invisible but still define them? And what's the role of community in that and helping to kind of deal with this?
Well, at least on the 23andMe, there are all these conversations and these threads that go way back from the beginning of the company. Well, and then so when we launched the APOE report, people who were finding out they were either 3-4 or 4-4, which increases your risk for Alzheimer's correspondingly, they were coming together and just forming these long conversations and going out and doing research and reading the literature of what are the preventive things we could be doing. It was called APOE Cafe. It was so cool because all these people were just like, hey, I found out I'm a 4-4, my risk is up, but it's down the road in my future. This is late, it's more predictive of late stage Alzheimer's. And I think a lot of people just felt empowered, like, well, at least we're all here together, we're talking to each other, and there are things that we could potentially start doing that could slow that pace. And so, but it's a really interesting question because I do think people, even though it might be something that's a negative, people start to own it. Like I know I do, and my mom, I will just put it out there, is a 4-4, and she's 85, and she has a better memory than I do. So it's also not predictive, So that's the good news, is that this stuff it's a relative risk, and I think we're going to learn more and more about preventive things that we can do. So at least personally, that's how I look at it.
So we are at time. I would say if there's any other questions, I'm sure the panel wouldn't mind hanging around for a couple of minutes afterwards to answer any of those. But I did want to take this opportunity not only to thank the audience for spending the last hour with us,